Live. Live. Cool.
All right. Can everyone hear me? All right. So why don't we go ahead and get started then? So it is my honor and delight to be here. We are here with the Historical Materialisms broadcast. My name is Alexa Eva. I'm a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm here with Alexander Billet and Crystal Stella Becerril, and we are here to talk a little bit about our work, and also, most importantly, to celebrate Alex's great new book, Shake the City: Experiments in Space and Time, Music, and Crisis, which just came out on November 2022. You can order it now at 1968press.co.uk, and there is a link on the YouTube page. So please do click on that and order this amazing book. Yeah, with that, I think we're just going to go ahead and get started. We'll each speak for maybe 15-20 minutes, and then I'll start asking a few questions, and then we'll open the questions up to all of you. So while we're speaking, definitely start thinking about things that you'd like to ask us and ways of bringing our work together. I'm really excited to share this space with other comrades who are working on the intersections between art and the public and organizing. So thanks for having me, and I'm really excited to be here. So I'll just go ahead and introduce Alexander Billet, who is a writer, artist, and author of Shake the City: Experiments in Space and Time, Music, and Crisis, published in 2022 by 1968 Press. And he has also written for the Los Angeles Review of Books, Salvage, Jacobin, In These Times, and other publications. He is a member of the Locust Arts and Letters Collective and helps edit its publications Locust Review and Imago. He lives with his partner and 2 cats in Los Angeles.
All right. Thank you very much for that introduction, Julia, and thank you to everyone for being here. I'm going to be using a PowerPoint presentation, so people will just let me, just give me a minute to share my screen. And there we go. And I'm gonna be. Oh, hold on. Okay. Am I sharing my screen?
No, not yet.
Okay. Hold on just one second. Apologies. Okay, there we have it. All right. So I foolishly forgot to print out my the paper that I need to present, so I need to do it on the same screen as this. So if people will bear with me, I've got to go through the slides in PowerPoint, which you see before you, without going into the full slideshow. So my apologies about that, but I believe people will still be able to get the sense of what I'm saying. We'll just call it Brechtian. We'll just say that you're seeing the process through which I made this slideshow and talk. Okay. The starting point of Shake the City is the pressing, growing need to chart a course out of the ideological and material impasse of late neoliberalism and capitalism. Nobody needs to be reminded that we're in this impasse, I think, this sort of roadblock in front of our ability to imagine a future better than one of climate catastrophe and the socialized sadism of the far right. But what I argue here and in the book, which I am intensely proud and relieved to finally have published, is a bit provocative. What I'm arguing is that what's missing from the contemporary left's approach isn't necessarily revolutionary theory or strategy, though those are necessary. I don't want to discount those at all. We certainly need better versions of them. But these could also be strengthened, our theory, our strategy, by giving more consideration to the aesthetic and creative valences of everyday life, the role that art plays in maintaining and resisting capitalism. And so with that in mind, I'd like to start the way the book does, with a brief sketch of our relationship with music. Prior to the 20th century, if we think back to what we've learned, music was by its nature an open air valence. Listening to music it was an open air experience. Excuse me. Listening to music most typically required someone playing it in front of you, and likely others included in the listening too. Now, with the advent of recorded sound, that started to change. The advent of recorded sound was also the musical experiences, the advent of the musical experiences privatization, enabling us to keep music locked away in private homes with phonographs and record players. But it was only after World War II, when personal headphones became commercially available, that music could be made into an exclusive, individualistic, and eventually portable experience. The contrast between possibility and reality in music, therefore, is stark. In modern music, in its modern experience, is very stark. Streaming services and personal mobile devices have made it feasible to put the virtual entirety of recorded sound in human history at our fingertips. And yet, they also blunt, in fact, severely, music's historically social nature. When Mark Fisher in Capitalist Realism described the state instilled by this mode of listening as one of ed-iPod consumer bliss, I don't think he was being haughty or elitist. Rather, I think he was emphasizing the anhedonia that seemed to come standard with this state, the way in which it cuts the listener off from social interaction, in contrast to, say, listening to an album or attending a concert with others. Again, an inherently social experience. And this runs in conjunction with an increasingly privatized existence generally. In our cities, public spaces have been privatized, commodified, policed. Most are so hostile to contemplation and organic gathering that calling them social can only be done with great generosity to the term. And notably, music, or at least sound, plays a role in maintaining the alienation of urban space, be it restrictions on public performance, such as busking, loud amplification of classical music in train stations, which I know is being done in some cities to essentially chase out young people late at night, or even the use of acoustic cannons dispersing protesters. You look at the ways in which music and sound are employed to maintain control over the city. This is not the only way in which the privatization of music and public space converge, however. They do so on a far more elemental level. For when capitalism spread through colonialism, imperialism, and industrialization, one of its most dramatic changes was to bring the entire globe into a very specific, universal relationship to time itself. The repetitive, tightly wound rhythms of commodity production, of the assembly line and scientific management came to predominate and came to dominate people's lives. Mark Abel, in his book, Groove, An Aesthetic of Measured Time, maps how this impacted the composition of popular music, not just in encircling musical production itself into the industrial process, but by forcing workers and artists from all over the world into the same space. This cosmopolitanism created a tight rhythmic mode, not just exhibited in percussion, but in virtually all the instrumentation that is unique to music under industrial capitalism, the way in which all of the instrumentation interacts in this very repetitive, almost hypnotic way. And these are characteristics shared in very different ways. This is not to deny the diversity, the wide diversity of music that exists under capitalism, but they are all shared in one way or another. They are different manifestations of this relationship to time. We hear it in the blues, Afrobeat, rock and roll, samba, hip hop, reggae, techno, so on and so forth. Now, a worthy question is whether this is entirely extrinsic to the way our spaces are organized. Marxist urban geographer Henri Lefebvre thought no. His rhythm analysis identified and sought to illustrate the ways in which our cities have also been shaped to instill certain rhythms in the behaviors of those who inhabit them. The ways in which certain streets, town squares, intersections are designed to usher certain amounts and certain types of people in and out of them as suited to the needs of work and commerce. And this is even truer in the age of the algorithm, I would argue, whose own ordered structures are intended to insinuate the logic of commodity and policing into every hidden corner of the city via surveillance, smart cities, and the use of algorithms in delivery apps, so on and so forth. There's so many examples that people can think of in that. Now, the next question, therefore, is, does popular music under capitalism complement and supplement the commodification and privatization of public space? And one thinker, another thinker who would have emphatically answered yes, was Theodor Adorno. Now, we all know Adorno's withering critiques of popular music. They're fairly infamous by now. To him, the way in which popular music aped the rhythm of the assembly line could only be an attempt to capture our leisure time for our return to work, to content us with this life of dull and repetitive drudgery. Now, I think there's actually value in this. I don't think anyone can look at the streaming services like Spotify and the pressure that their algorithms put on artists to narrow the scope of their songwriting and deny that this outlook has a certain amount of value. However, I think the limitation is that it's only one side of the coin. Adorno's major flaw doesn't take into account the historical contingency of commodities domination over music. Now, Stuart Hall is someone who I sort of use to balance this out. And in his notes on deconstructing the popular, I think that work better captures the dynamism in this relationship between commodity and the culture industry and culture itself and culture production, sort of the ebb and flow depending on the balance of class forces. Every instance of culture under capitalism, certainly in today's landscape, is shaped by both top-down and bottom-up influences, the cosmopolitanism that I was talking about earlier. For Marxists, the question must not just be of capital's sort of singular domination over music and creativity, but rather how an inversion of that process might take place. If the neoliberal musical experience serves to buttress the spatial domination of time, is there a way in which the intervention of working and oppressed people into music can reverse that domination? This is really the key question, the fulcrum on which the whole of Shake the City turns. And the answer to this question, I think, is not so far-fetched. We think of marches, we think of demonstrations, picket lines, occupations, strikes. You know, they often include, most of the time, 99% of the time, they include this rhythmic or musical component of their own through chanting, singing, the direction of marches. And we might ask how these unexpected rhythms and sounds change the feel of an urban environment. Now, during the UK student rebellion of 2010, we saw poor and working class young people, disproportionately youth of color, rebel against funding cuts and fee hikes in education. The demonstrations, I'm sure anyone who was in the UK during that time remembers, these were massive militant demonstrations, and they certainly showed a willingness to transform space, if only by smashing windows, taking over Millbank and things like that. Most amply illustrated, this process, I think, though, was most amply illustrated in the December demonstration, the day of the education bill's passage. So if you look at Parliament Square, for example, which is in this photo right here, albeit in the background, this is an open space that ostensibly exists for public gathering in London, however, within very strict limits of acceptability. And it had those limits tested, I would argue, through fire, graffiti, the defiance of police orders. But it was also, if you will, a transformation of time, not just of space, but of time, specifically reflected in the music that wafted through the air that night. And this has also been sort of immortalized by Paul Mason, who mistakenly dubbed it first the Dubstep Rebellion, then the Grime Rebellion. But even though only a small handful of the songs played that night were in fact of the grime genre, there is something telling in that label, I would argue, and others have argued too, such as Dan Hancock's. Grime, as people will know, was for some time sort of a bête noire of British popular culture. Until relatively recently, it was essentially banned on the radio. Grime shows were targeted by police. And this had everything to do with the fact that it was rooted in the experiences of poor youth of color confined to the neglected housing estates of London and other such urban areas. As such, grime's relationship to time is consciously oppositional. If you think about the thudding beats, the buzzing instrumentation, these are intended sort of as a shock to the placid acceptability that exists outside the tower block, replacing it with a threat of a reconfigured use for the surrounding world. I think it's more than a bit symbolic. If you see this picture right here, this is a still from Skepta's video for That's Not Me. And it features the MC using headphones as a microphone, almost as if to consciously reverse Fisher's Ed iPod consumer bliss that I mentioned earlier, sort of forcibly reestablishing music as a social experience against its literal walling off. And therefore, I think when we call the student rebellions a grime rebellion, we're taking into account this inextricability of time and space, that we cannot change one without changing the other, and our relationship to music as an aestheticization of time can play a very unique role in that. And you look at the way the Parliament Square was sort of reinvented as a dance floor that night at the passage of the Education Reform Bill, you get a sense of what I'm saying. And I think you also get a sense of what I'm saying, because this is not just unique to the music of the 2010s thereabouts. It's you can also see it in the rave scene, of the 80s and early 90s. This was a scene that deliberately sought out disused and abandoned urban space, warehouses, overpasses, old factories, and transformed them. Just as Chicago housed Detroit techno or London drum and bass artists manipulated sounds into rhythms and melodies nobody had ever heard before, so were these locations transformed from neglected, no longer useful by the logic of neoliberalism, to being sort of these utopian spaces of sort of infinite celebration. And these kinds of encounters and constructed situations, if you will, to borrow a term from the Situationists and Francis Stracey, I don't think these are just pretty edges around serious strategies of revolution. And the politicization of the rave scene after Thatcher essentially tried to ban raves in the 80s and 90s, shows that these aren't just pretty edges around strategies of revolution, as I was saying. They're essential to instilling a collective sense of possibility, even of wonder, in a neoliberal landscape that seeks to negate possibility and wonder at every turn. So, in other words, just to look at sort of both ends of the dialectic here, yes, the construction of popular music under capitalism reflects a tight and ostensibly impenetrable domination of time over the individual, but it also contains an element of anticipation, in which the experience of every note and beat is dependent on those that came after, before, or simultaneous to it. Each moment in a song, therefore, captures what Walter Benjamin calls Yeatsite in the Theses on the Concept of History. This feeling of this way of experiencing time of heightened anticipation, and the idea that this idea of revolutionary rupture, that each moment can be the same as what just came before, but also might contain within it the possibility to put time and history on a radically different trajectory. And so I think basically it instills a different structure of feeling a structure of feeling that is more harmonious with the world, if you'll pardon the term, with the world around us. Sort of the creation of a different human subject, a different relationship to time and space, and a different future entirely. To make this future collectively imaginable, then, is an urgent task. Now, there are some examples for how to do this that I will just sort of go through briefly. One is the example of the Union of Musicians and Allied Workers that was formed during the pandemic here in the United States. This is, as the name suggests, a union for musicians and others who work in the music industry or music venues. But what's interesting about them is that they connect the conditions in which they create and make music to the condition of the world at large. Their working conditions are our living conditions, the conditions of everyday life. So they have working groups around the Green New Deal, Medicare for all, police abolition, etc. And they also make a very clear commitment to geographic justice and opposing gentrification. When I spoke to one of their members about their current campaign to get Spotify to pay streaming artists a fair wage or a fair compensation, they made a connection between streaming services' approach to music and how gentrification has robbed artists of spaces to live, work, create, and perform for relatively cheaply and free from the pressures of marketability. Now, so this is just one example of sort of creating an infrastructure of cultural dissent, what I would argue, these spaces that attempt to create experiences of time and space that are quite different from what neoliberalism tries to force upon us. And that's very different than actually changing the world at large. So there's a great many steps between this kind of methodical, painstaking foundation of unions, groups, networks, and the kinds of social explosions that can be driven forward by the same infrastructure. These are the kinds of groups that make links across geography and temporality, connecting participants with sometimes hidden pasts and stitching together the rhythms of different subaltern lives. And when these moments of uprising come out of nowhere, these are the structures that also provide them with coherence and direction. So once again, this goes just as much for arts and culture as it does for theory and strategy. If you look at the 2019 Estallido Social in Chile, this mass uprising of strikes and protests in the country that for some people, in some people's view, basically violently birthed the neoliberal order. You start to see this kind of way of transforming space on a mass scale, this way of transforming time on a mass scale. One of the best known videos that came out of the uprising was this one. And people may be familiar with this. Now, that, of course, is Quilapayun's El Pueblo Unido Jamás Será Vencido, a song that came out of the waves of protest in Chile in the 1960s and 70s, a song that was, once again, essentially banned after Pinochet's regime overthrew the democratic socialist experiment of the Allende government. And it's being played in 2019, out in the open, in a public square, again, inviting artist and protester alike to engage in public space in such a way that really breaks down the division between artist, protester, and whatever, and regular working and oppressed people. And in turn, I would argue, it redefines public space as something that can nurture collective human subjectivity and collective futurity. Not only this, but it's being played by a classical orchestra of around 500 people and choir, which is significant because, as someone in Chile pointed out to me, there's this long association in Chile between classical music and right-wing politics. But nonetheless, as the estallido really took off, there were networks, formal and informal, some of which had existed before, others that were fairly improvised among musicians, unions, mutual aid networks that were able to organize among musicians to make something like this possible. And so in wrapping up, because I know I've already gone over time, in other words, in the context of mass protest and upheaval, this level of organization was able to branch out and in turn rearrange the points of reference between music and public space, subjectivity and creativity, art and everyday democracy, past and present and future, space and time. This, I would argue, is why art, music, creative and cultural resistance are an invaluable, albeit tragically neglected, coordinate for the way out of capitalist realism. The ideological and political impasse we face simply will not be broken, I would argue, if we continue to neglect this facet of human, social, and political life. I think we are at a moment where we desperately need to not just theorize what a different world would look like, but to be able to make that theory a matter of psychological and emotional feeling. And I don't think we can deny the role of the arts and of music in helping provide that for us, and the spaces we can make that can make that felt for ordinary working and oppressed people. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my my screen, and I'm going to pass it over to our chair and also one of the speakers and discussants for today, who you met earlier. Julia Alexa Eva is an assistant professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania and creator of the award-winning graphic memoir, Soviet Daughter, A Graphic Revolution. She has published traditional academic articles and graphic essays on the ties between global leftist politics and nonfiction. She is currently finishing up a book project titled Anti-Fascist Avant-Garde, Radical Documentary in Japan, France, and the USSR. So I will pass it over to you, Julia.
Great. Thanks so much for that introduction. Can everyone see the slides? Okay, great. Yeah, I'm very excited to be here to celebrate Alex's book, and also because I think all of our projects sort of dovetail really beautifully into Shake the City. Mine kind of looks a little bit more at what kind of art might you call anti-imperialist or anti-fascist, and what kind of art should we be emphasizing in terms of the connection between the experience of everyday life and the individual artwork. So I'll just be looking, I'm reading sort of sections from the introduction and first chapter of the book that I'm almost finished writing. So it's not quite in a beautiful finished stage the way that Shake the City is, so bear with me. Yeah, I'm just gonna go ahead and get started. So in the last 10 minutes of Soviet filmmaker Dziga Vertov's 1929 avant-garde documentary, Man with a Movie Camera, the eponymous cameraman shows the viewer a woman wielding a rifle during target practice. You kind of see this on the lower right-hand corner of the screen. Her target, a rather silly-looking cardboard cutout of a man in a top hat emblazoned with a swastika. And you see that on the left-hand side. In other words, a fascist. Vertov cuts from fascist to woman 12 times, each shot with decreasing length and accelerated rhythm, until finally the woman pulls the trigger, and after she successfully hits her target, a hidden mechanism reveals a sign. In Ukrainian, it reads Batska fascismu, and translated as father of fascism. More accurately, the term is a diminutive, a father fascism, or even a daddy fascism, implying a silliness along with an evil. The scene follows one set in a beer hall in which Veritas' dizzying camera work, with the camera careening from side to side, induces something akin to drunkenness in the viewer. Cuts become increasingly quick, exploding into cacophony, until suddenly a frame pauses on an image of Lenin on the facade of a building. As if finally able to breathe, the camera pans over to a placard, the Lenin Workers' Club. The camera enters the space and we see several feats of stop motion and reverse reel. Hands sweep over first a checkerboard and then a chessboard, setting the game for play as if by magic. In between these sequences, Veritas shows us images of solitary men and women reading newspapers. The aforementioned scene of fascist killing follows. The slower, deliberate montage in this Workers' Club sequence, seemingly worlds apart from the drunken camera a mere 20 seconds prior, indicates tacit approval of the events presented. Despite its lack of intertitles, this concluding scene guides us in an interpretation of events presented through tricks of editing and cinematography. Veritas, who was born in 1896 and died in 1954, so just a few months after the death of Stalin, created avant-garde documentaries far before the term documentary was first publicized by John Grierson in the 1930s. And I'll talk a little bit more about John Grierson a little bit later on. Veritas films aim to emancipate the viewer's political sensibility, heretofore chained to what Samuel Beckett called the ballast of habit, through a series of disruptive and playful aesthetic techniques. This filmmaking style, which he called the kino eye, is meant to lead to a freer and more active form of perception in the viewer, recovering a perception normally subsumed by the drudgery of everyday life. Given the canonical status of Man with a Movie Camera, it is curious that this part of the film has, to my knowledge, never been addressed outright. And it appears oddly prescient. More than 12 years before the Soviet Union's entry into what will be called the Great Patriotic War, Veritas' kino eye warns against fascism and presents us with the aid of the rifle-shooting woman, a corrective to the fascist threat. The scene appears especially and eerily poignant given Veritas' Jewish heritage. He was born David Abelevich Kaufman, or of Bialystok in the Pale of Settlement, the only territory in which Jews were allowed to live until the Bolshevik Revolution. Veritas' parents would die in the Holocaust before the end of the war. The scene presents us with several layers of meaning and several methods of combating the fascist threat. The first is literal. Work on your aim, Soviet women, and you too can kill a fascist in battle. However, the film emphasizes another anti-fascist corrective, his truki, or tricks of editing and cinematography. Not only do its truki show the viewer the power of filmmaking, but they also have another inherently anti-fascist function. They expose the fundamental createdness and artificiality of the cinematic medium. In Annette Michelson's words, Veritas films operate, quote, through the systematic subversion of the certitudes of illusion, a threshold in the development of consciousness, end quote. By engaging in a constant epistemological questioning, Veritas films teach us how to see. And this, I argue, is key to the form of the anti-fascist documentary. In my in-progress book, Anti-Fascist Avant-Garde, Radical Documentary in Japan, France, and the USSR, I argue that one cannot derive an artwork's fascist or anti-fascist nature from just explicitly militant content, but rather that a certain style of documentary filmmaking works explicitly to emancipate the viewer from a fascist mindset. The book argues that a network of documentary filmmakers, drawing from Dziga Veritas' work in the 1920s and continuing to radical communist filmmakers practicing in the 1960s, conceived of experimental documentary as an anti-imperialist and anti-fascist form and praxis. The book highlights French and Japanese avant-garde documentarists and theorists in particular, some who, like French Nouvelle Vague filmmakers Chris Marker and Jean-Luc Godard, and Japanese art historian Hanada Kiyoteru, named Veritas and the Soviet avant-garde as an explicit source of influence. Yet the project also highlights groupings of other filmmakers and theorists who investigated the radical leftist potential of avant-garde and surrealist inflected form in documentary. Louis Buñuel, Hélène René, Agnès Varda, Matsumoto Toshio, and a lot of the background images on this particular slide are either Dziga Veritas' Man with the Movie Camera and Kino Eye films, and Matsumoto Toshio's Funeral Parade of Roses, which is like a really beautiful sort of continuation of Veritas thinking in 1969. So along with Matsumoto Toshio, Hanisa Sumu, Imamura Shohei, Kuroki Kazuo, and Terayama Shuji. Taken together, such figures exist in a constellation of interconnected anti-fascist and anti-imperialist documentary practices that are truly transnational in nature. Veritas' work provides a crucial and prophetic introduction to the avant-garde documentary as an aesthetics of liberation. His editing tricks lead to a clarified understanding of the fundamental createdness of so-called documentality. For Michelson, this, quote, result articulated most powerfully through the presentation of the filmmaking, editing, and projection process is a revelation, an exposure of the terms and dynamics of cinematic illusionism, end quote. As Vertov described it, his goal was the preparation of viewers for the reception of new things. The playfulness of tricks, whether it is through animation, montage, and other editing techniques, leads to a more robust, entirely new Soviet mentality and mode of perception, one that rejuvenates the senses. For Vertov, the ideal Soviet mind is not only one that shoots a fascist with a rifle. Perhaps more importantly, it is also a mind that marvels at a chessboard arranged with a single sweep of a hand, a mind capable of perceiving other whimsical scenes featured in Vertov's films, such as lobsters dancing on a plate, a cameraman emerging from a mug of beer, and a tripod bowing coyly to its audience. For it is this mind, liberated from the shackles of habit, scientifically rigorous in its questioning of reality, but simultaneously, and perhaps paradoxically, re-enchanted by a life caught unawares. And this term, life caught unawares, is the sort of subheadline for Vertov's first feature-length film, Kino Eye, or Kina Glas, that is capable of recognizing fascism in the first place. Crucially, Vertov's films function at the level of the individual. As Joshua Malitsky notes, Vertov's films educate citizens in the proper way of behaving as individuals in post-revolutionary society, and they provide the tools necessary to begin transforming the self. I go further, however, in arguing that avant-garde documentary films, starting with but not limited to Vertov, question the seemingly infallible nature of reality. In so doing, such films use disorientation to train the viewer's mind in the liberatory and anti-fascist praxis of questioning. However, one must note that the name Vertov in this project is less representative of a singular individual than an aggregate of his collaborators and comrades, such as his brothers Boris and Mikhail, and editor and wife Elizaveta Svilova. And the concept of a systematic disruption goes beyond Vertov in the 1920s. It is also crucially tied to formalist Viktor Shklovsky's concept of остранение, or estrangement, and to a lesser extent Bertolt Brecht's alienation effect, more familiar to the French and Japanese filmmakers highlighted in this project than the work of Shklovsky. Miriam Hansen likewise has found resonances to this perceptual disruption in the work of Walter Benjamin, another key figure in this project. As Hansen reminds us, quote, Benjamin knew all too well that the primary objective of capitalist film practice was to perpetuate that mythical chain of mirrors. Therefore, if film were to have a critical and cognitive function, it had to disrupt that chain and assume the task of all politicized art, not to duplicate the illusion as real, but to interpret reality as itself illusion. The task of any truly political art is critical and cognitive. It must unveil the fundamental illusory quality of so-called reality, that mythical chain of mirrors. And I should mention, for those of you that haven't recently seen films like Veritas Man with the Movie Camera, there are several famous scenes in which you see the editor of the film, Svilova, work on the film itself and splice the films into existence. So there's a famous scene in which we see sort of people riding alongside the eponymous cameraman in a horse-drawn carriage, and suddenly the horses stop. And we realize that what we're watching is actually the film being created as we are watching it. And there are sort of many, many scenes in which you see the audience watching the film that we have just been watching. So constantly kind of bringing you out and in and out and in to the diegesis of the film. Benjamin thus forms another pivotal star in this anti-fascist constellation. Almost every single existing volume on anti-fascism in art by figures such as Jennifer Barker, Mark Bray, Jack Bradich, and Patrick Nathan cite Benjamin as a crucial figure in their analysis. And indeed, the work we are celebrating today, Alexander Billet's Shake the City, cites Benjamin throughout, which I was very happy to see. One might interpret the increasingly frequent reliance on the texts of Benjamin, theoretician of fascism and aesthetic experience, as well as its tragic victim, as a radical act in itself. Art for Vertov, as well as Benjamin, must be a critique and a challenge. As Vertov claimed, the dizzying range of experimental techniques in his films challenge the human eye's visual representation of the world and declare its own distinct defamiliarizing I see. And in Russian, this is svoyo vizhu. Vertov's camera wrests the viewer away from their status quo, reorganizing images of the everyday and placing them in an unexpected and montaged stage. The perfection of the camera's vision exists less for itself and more for human beings to recover their perceptive abilities, training the eye to regard the world anew. Its gaze lies in the interstices of subjectivity and objectivity, neither scientifically precise nor full of human fallibility. However, this avant-garde distancing effect is profoundly sensorial and effective. Vertov's films exemplify a new type of direct, unmediated sensuality. In Russian, this is called chuvstvennost, opposed to a cold and restrictive bourgeois art. As he declared, we need conscious men, not an unconscious mass submissive to any passive suggestion. Vertov aimed for his films to activate their viewers, to inspire a re-engagement with life and with feeling, resulting inevitably in an awakening of political consciousness. The Kino eye is importantly in contradistinction to the ideology of John Grierson, the Scottish filmmaker and theorist who famously coined the term documentary. For Grierson, writing in 1931, the seemingly infinite tricks of Vertov's camera inspired more suspicion than reverence. And this is a quote from his review of Kino eye in 1931. Some of us have been hearing a great deal about the Kino eye, and it has worried us considerably. Only the younger highbrows seem to know anything about it. They have dashed back from their continental rambles with their hair more rumpled, neck more open, and time more non-existent for gazing on it. But on the whole, articulation has failed them, and it has been difficult to gather from their wild young words what particular mesmeric value this Kino eye possessed. End quote. Grierson's description of the young cinephilic highbrows with their hair rumpled is as comedic as it is patronizing. Why, he seems to ask the youngins with their neck more open, due to their non-existent ties, does Vertov have such an appeal? Vertov's magic appears not to work on Grierson, the self-declared public servant and propagandist whom Peter Morris tied to neoconservatist and even racist ideologies. Grierson also declared that Man with the Movie Camera was not a film at all, but a snapshot album, not a finished complete work of art, but a barrage of tricks. Curiously, the 1960s would see future socialist filmmakers create works that resonate strongly with Vertov's snapshot albums. Matsumoto Toshio's Ishinu Uta, or Song of the Stone from 1963, Agnès Varda's Salut les Cubains from 1963, and Chris Marker's La Jetée from 1962, come immediately to mind as paradigmatic examples of quote-unquote snapshot albums on film. Yet in the same review, Grierson argues that the concept of the Kino eye, if taken seriously, would lead to sheer absurdity. Quote, here by the reductio ad absurdum is proof for the schoolboys, he said. Yet despite Grierson's patronizing rejection of the Kino eye as absurdity, and even what Gilles Deleuze and Felix describe as psychosis, this might in fact be the answer. My use of fascism as a conceptual framework is closely tied to Deleuze and Guattari's expansive notion of fascism in Anti-Oedipus, their study of the concept in relation to what they term schizoanalysis, as opposed to psychoanalysis might, as Michel Foucault postulates, be alternately titled An Introduction to a Non-Fascist Life. In his preface to Anti-Oedipus, he writes that Deleuze and Guattari's concept of fascism is not only historical fascism, the fascism of Hitler and Mussolini, but also the fascism in us all, in our heads and in our everyday behavior, the fascism that causes us to love power, to desire the very thing that dominates us and exploits us, end quote. The fascism of this book likewise expands beyond a fascism witnessed in actually existing ultra-right-wing parties, although it certainly and necessarily includes them. I follow Jack Bradich in this understanding of fascism, which finds fascism in microspheres of everyday life, as well as in the usual social and political venues, and aims to understand fascism's emergent dimensions, the subtle dynamics in play before historical expressions manifest. This project is thus inspired by Bradich's concept of microfascism, which also draws from Deleuze and Guattari, with micro not referring to small in scale, but something multiple and molecular rather than coherent and uniform, a proliferation of resonances, practices, and relations that can cohere into operative bodies and collective agencies. Unquote. Importantly, Bradich's analysis controversially claims that microfascism can even erupt in leftist movements. It is pervasive and latent, embedding itself in our relationships and in our subjectivities. Alongside Bradich, the fascism described in this book is not only, I already read that, my bad. The battle against fascism is a battle that must be fought daily and perpetually in the human mind. This project brings together documentary films which equip us with phenomenological and epistemological tools to fight this everyday battle. I've listed just a few examples here. And actually in my project, I expand it beyond films that we might consider documentaries. Many films in the 1960s sort of straddle this line between documentary and fiction, and there was even this term semi-documentary that was applied to a lot of the films during this time period. So in the larger project, I include a lot of those films as well. And a lot of these directors are working between these two media of documentary and narrative fiction film. It is the media and aesthetic counterpart to what Mark Bray describes as everyday anti-fascism. Such films work together in an explicit desire for the viewer's liberation through the destabilizing forces of experimental documentary. These are films which might leave the viewer with, as Gerson wrote, hair rumpled, neck open, tie non-existent, an ecstatic and indeed anti-fascist mode of viewership and filmmaking that embraces disorientation and estrangement, and at times even magic wonder and re-enchantment for their liberatory potential. The anti-fascist artwork rejects systematization, unity, and a single meaning. It emphasizes flows, difference, multiplicity, and the nomadic. It refuses to provide the viewer with photographic evidence of an easily consumable and believable reality. In Veritas films, pens write their own intertitles. Stop-motion lobsters dance on a plate. Chessboards arrange themselves as with the sweep of a hand. Bread unbakes itself and returns to wheat fields, and bowls come back to life. Veritas' camera goes far beyond documentation. It enters into the ebb and flow of human life, renders itself visible, and performs magic tricks for the viewer's gaze. His emphasis on tricks, including animation, reminds us that the etymological root of animation is the Latin animare, to give life to quicken, to bring to life, to refresh, to revive, to rouse, to inspire with life or with movement. The anti-fascist avant-garde documentary shapes and transforms actuality footage, animating film, and viewer alike. Thank you. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our last speaker. Crystal Stella Becerril is a writer, runner, and tenant and labor organizer. In 2020 and 2021, she led a successful 17-month-long rent strike in response to the COVID-19 global health crisis. And in 2022, she launched the People's Radical Book Club to create space for intentional collective political education. She lives, works, and struggles in New York City.
Awesome. Thanks, Julia. And thanks, both of you for your really excellent contributions. It was so good to hear them. And congratulations again to Alex, who we're here to celebrate. Thanks again for having me here. So my paper is titled Worth Living For, Recentering the Right to Beauty, Rest, Pleasure as Organizing Principle and Principle Demand. So being a communist means constantly dispelling old tropes about characterless, flavorless, monochrome, standard issue everything under communism, and insisting that, on the contrary, there will be an increased access to beauty, leisure, and leisure for all under a classless society. As communists and abolitionists, some of our most challenging work is is to help expand the collective imagination about what is possible in the future and how we can help those possibilities materialize. However, for as sharp as our analysis is and revolutionary our visions of the future are, we continue to struggle to make our present one that buoys our tired spirits and inspires us to keep organizing and fighting. A sober and realist approach to our increasingly precarious, violent, and fascistic present should not just be the prerequisite for recentering the need for militant organizing, community building, and mutual aid, but an opportunity to reclaim our right to leisure, pleasure, and beautiful things. In this paper, I'll look at the ways in which simply understanding how dire our present reality is without structures to help ordinary people access pleasure, rest, care, and beauty in the face of compounded and worsening capitalist crises only leads to burnout, increased trauma at the collective and individual levels, and eventually to either defeatism or nihilism, neither of which serve our movements or cause. It is not enough and cannot be enough to only have a future worth fighting for anymore. If we want to build militant, sustainable, and self-renewing movements that can stand a fighting chance, we must make the present one that is filled with things and moments worth living for. To make this possible, we must make our right to rest, care, and beauty, not just an organizing principle for the future we wish to create, but a present principle demand we must actively and intentionally create for ourselves now. Now, as Alex brilliantly articulates in his book's introduction, at a time when dystopia is so unbearably ever present, so overweening and unavoidable, can we afford to so easily relinquish the utopian? The answer is an emphatic no. There is still a utopian narrative to be claimed and reinvigorated. Doing so cannot be an afterthought for a strategy of radical transformation, dismissed like we have been taught to do with the human imagination. No, the utopian imaginary must be at the center of this strategy. To show people that another world is conceivable is a priori essential to making it possible. And in his book, The Communism of Love, Richard Gilman Opolsky writes, according to Marx, alienation is one of the distinguishing features of life in capitalist society that disfigures healthy human relations and the well-being of individual people. What kind of community can an alienated person help comprise? Alienated persons cannot comprise the communist community because in so doing, they would cease to be alienated. Thus, where alienation reigns, community recedes, dissipates, or disappears. For Marx, capitalism exacerbates all earlier forms of alienation by multiplying processes of estrangement in work and society. In subverting and degrading the human community, capitalism subverts and degrades the human person too, as the individual is best situated from the perspective of capital as a tool, an instrument. Now, part of the reason for the lack of appeal to radical politics by the general population, I believe, is that beyond the enormous, beyond the enormous amounts of propaganda against it, is the instinctual rejection to the introduction of even more struggle into our lives. No one, including those of us who are militant organizers, wants to struggle more than they already do, even if today's struggle could mean a better, less dire future for us. What distinguishes those who willingly choose to enter into struggle and those who don't is a principled commitment to the deep knowing that another world is not only possible, but one that we deserve, and the community that you are in struggle with that sustains you and replenishes you when the going gets tough inevitably. However, the glorification of struggle and suffering as a sort of rite of passage by many radicals and revolutionaries often creates the visceral rejection of those politics which those we are trying to appeal to would benefit from. Therefore, we must appeal to people's yearning for connection, self-expression, rest, beauty, and pleasure, not as something to be had only once we've paid our dues in the battlefields of class war, but as things that we are deserving of now, and which will make the sacrifices and suffering we will inevitably have to endure not more palatable, but rather less taxing, allowing us individually and collectively build up reserves from which to draw on for the class struggle that will likely be engaged in the majority of our lives. Now, there are three main areas that we can and should begin to recenter if we want to recruit people into militant class struggle and retain them. Those are creative culture, mutual aid, and the new commons, the creation of the new commons, and love and healing. I'll begin by looking at the most immediate places where we can cultivate and nurture pleasure, rest, beauty, space for healing and love, and that is the places where we live. In her 2020 book, Coronavirus, Class, and Mutual Aid in the United Kingdom, Rhiannon Firth writes, mutual aid is the practical and economic expression of the social principle. It involves solidarity, not charity, and seeks social change through direct action rather than reform. The practice aims to prefigure a new effective life world by recomposing social bonds and community rather than reproducing commodified power relationships, whilst creating self-management and autonomy by meeting needs directly. In anarchist theory, mutual aid is a highly politicized phenomenon which links the pleasure and joy of non-hierarchical relationships with structural critiques of capitalism and the state by illustrating that another world is possible and practicing it in the here and now. Now, mutual aid networks, rent strikes, community fridges to support our elderly and disabled neighbors all cropped up in cities all around the US and all around the world during the first year of the pandemic, providing a glimpse of the possibilities for organizing people where their struggles are most acute around housing and food. Unfortunately, these did not endure beyond the first year of the pandemic in most places, as governments and the media normalized the unprecedented global health crisis, mass death and disability in order to get us all back to work and back to endless consumption. As necessary as being able to meet people's immediate needs is, especially in a time of rapidly compounding crises and hyper precarity, we must encourage and create mutual aid networks that also provide access to things that restore and replenish us, cooking for each other, offering childcare, not just so parents can go to work, but so that they can rest and enjoy some leisure time. Sharing resources and skills through lending libraries for tools and equipment, not just books, and by skill sharing skills like cooking, gender-affirming makeup application and styling, home organization and repair, gardening, art making, etc., making our individual and collective lives more about more than just survival. By providing support and skill sharing means we can more sustainably show up for the struggle in the streets, in our workplaces, and in our communities. Likewise, creating clean, accessible, and beautiful spaces for ourselves wherever and however possible is key to improving our mental health and affirming that we deserve safety, comfort, and pleasure. Organizing our neighbors to clean up and beautify our buildings and neighborhoods when landlords neglect them, reclaiming abandoned lots and turning them into community gardens, connecting unhoused neighbors with resources, all help create safety, joy, and a sense of responsibility towards each other, which in turn increases the likelihood of continued engagement. We can and should do all of this in tandem, of course, with organizing for public and affordable housing, expanded tenants' rights and protections, and an end to eviction policies across the board. Now, directly connected to our ability to show up and contribute and participate in struggle is our mental health. Therefore, centering connection, community, and healing should be regarded as a necessary part of building sustainable movements. Harm reduction, restorative justice, access to mental health services, collective learning of the skills it takes to nurture relationships of all kind, and take accountability and repair when harm has been caused should not be regarded as superfluous to the work of building a fighting left. We must move away from the Western approach to mental health and trauma healing that deals almost exclusively with the individual, even when it recognizes and considers institutional and structural harm and violence. Healing must include a collective process as well. To build community requires vigilant awareness of the work we must continually do to undermine all the socialization that leads us to behave in ways that perpetuate domination. A body of critical theory is now available that explains all the workings of white supremacist thought and racism. But explanations alone do not bring us to the practice of beloved community. When we take the theory, the explanations, and apply them concretely to our daily lives, to our experiences, we further and deepen the practice of transformation. This writes bell hooks in Teaching Community, a pedagogy of hope. Healthy connections and community make joy and pleasure more accessible, both of which are necessary for healing, individually and collectively. And the reality is that healthy people and communities are better able to show up for each other and for struggle than people who are battling mental health challenges without support and without respite from the cruelty and hardships of racism, transphobic violence, poverty, etc. The sharing of joy, whether physical, emotional, psychic, or intellectual, forms a bridge between the sharers, which can be the basis for understanding much of what is not shared between them and lessens the threat of their differences, writes Audre Lorde. Likewise, centering love, which is largely spoken about and considered almost exclusively in the romantic heteronormative formation, is key to not only creating healthy people and movements, but also central to the project of communism. Centering love must entail learning and unlearning what love is and is not, and to see it as an instinctual human pursuit because our survival depends on connection and community. As Richard Gilman-Opolsky writes, love and love relationships put us in touch with communist sensibilities and practices in the spaces of our little precarious communes. Love participates in the creation of our precarious little communes, which are increasingly necessary in a world defined by chaos and insecurity. We need now, more than ever before, a serious inquiry into the poverty of exchange value. The capitalist mode of assessing value is incapable of appreciating what human beings everywhere on earth value the most. This has to be one of the central lessons of the global pandemic. For all its multifarious meanings, love reveals the limits of capital to appropriately value the experiences and relationships that human beings treasure most. And lastly, creativity, self-expression, and culture. This is an arena with a rich history and tradition, as we've seen, that is also immensely exciting because self-expression and creativity are a driving force in any society. From the Harlem Renaissance and the New York ballroom scene to post-punk and jazz, art creates community, making it an obvious place to raise consciousness, cultivate radical militancy, but more importantly, expand our ability to imagine and create beyond our lived experiences. The stronger the presence of independent DIY art and creative communities, the lesser the appeal to mainstream celebrity culture and the capitalist ideals it glorifies. As Raymond William reminds us, culture is ordinary. That is the very first fact. Every human society has its own shape, its own purposes, its own meanings. And as Alex points out in his book, all creative arts play a role in sensitizing us to this world. And this is key in understanding art's paramount importance. And so it stands to reason that the more empowered ordinary working class people feel to connect with and create art for the sake of self-expression and connection to each other, than for fame and fortune, the more expansive our imagination of what we're capable of can become. Music is perhaps the most ubiquitous, accessible, and impactful of all modern art forms, and therefore a great source of both capitalist propaganda and also radical rebellion and reclamation. In his book, Alex writes, contemporary approaches to music far too often accept the division of art from everyday life. This acceptance ignores the very nature of both art and late capitalism, reinforcing the division of creativity and labor, depriving us of the full scope of the utopian imaginary. All are ways in which late capitalism instrumentalizes music to foster the domination of space over time, creating an impasse between the present and the future. While both music and the city could potentially be sites in which human beings collectively guide the trajectory of history, they are instead methods of alienating us from that trajectory. The vast majority are dispossessed to a degree that they are, in essence, made anachronistic, unable to sit at history's prow, mastered by it rather than masters of it. And this conjures up some of the most striking moments from the early days of the pandemic, where videos of musicians playing songs from balconies in Italy, New York, Paris went viral across platforms, reminding us not just of the power of music, but our instinct to reach for it. In Iran, protesters have adopted the song of Italian resistance to fascism, Bella Ciao, sharing their rendition in Farsi and posting them on TikTok to signal their commitment to struggle for freedom. Jazz, rock and roll, hip hop, all pioneered by the Black community in the US and rooted in struggle and resistance, have changed not just the musical landscape across the world, but in many ways the world itself. Asked what jazz is in 1966, saxophonist Archie Shepp responded, "Jazz is anti-war. It is opposed to the war in Vietnam. It is for Cuba. It is for the liberation of all people. That is the nature of jazz." Why is that so? Because jazz is a music itself born out of oppression, born out of the enslavement of my people. Jazz was and continues to be music rooted in resistance, possibility, and change, making rules only so they can be beautifully broken. Punk likewise represents an opportunity for angry but hopeful misfits to reclaim rage, rebellion, and destruction as birthright and obligation. For these reasons, both jazz and punk continue to be places of radical and revolutionary politics and potential. What makes both so necessary is their embodiment of ideas and ideals, not simply their intellectualization of them. Because music is felt before it is understood, prescriptiveness cannot hold, forcing creator and listener alike to learn new ways of listening, thinking, and experiencing. The expansiveness of these processes is, but should absolutely not be underestimated. Rock Against Racism, Afropunk, Decolonize Fest are all examples of community birth from music's revolutionary potential. In his book, Rip It Up and Start Again, The History of Post-Punk from 1978 to 1983, Simon Reynolds writes, many post-punk musicians were fighting back with protest songs and benefit gigs galore. Rock Against Racism became the template for a host of issue-based campaigns, including Rock Against Sexism, Rock Against Thatcher, and Scrap the SUS, a campaign against 19th century anti-vagrancy laws that enabled police to harass Black youth at will on the grounds of suspicious behavior. Bands like Gang of Four, the Macons, and Delta Phi were created and creating at the intersection of Marxist politics, anti-fascist organizing, and the struggle against the neoliberal assault on the working class by Thatcher and her administration. Then and now, political songwriting generally posits the singer and the audience as exempt from the evils being castigated. Rather than cozily dividing the world into a righteous us versus a corrupt them, Gang of Four's songs implicated listeners and themselves in the very processes being critiqued. But that didn't mean that there weren't sides worth taking or enemies worth fighting, writes Reynolds, adding that fascist skinheads also regularly materialized at gigs by Gang of Four and their allies, starting fights in the audience, throwing abuse and projectiles at the bands. Post-punk then was a site of critique and struggle as much as it was a musical moment that produced some of the most exciting bands and songs of the last century. The 90s and 2000s saw an explosion of queer women, women of color-led punk bands from Bikini Kill and Spit Boy in the US to Huggy Bear and Big Joni. Punk has been a place for queer women, Black women, women of color, and queers in general to challenge, reject, create, and rejoice. Of the importance of the Bay Area band Spit Boy and its drummer Michelle's memoir, The Spit Boy Rule, Mimi Nguyen writes, it is perhaps obvious to say that the Spit Boy Rule, the book, is crucial to our necessary and necessarily imperfect histories of Black and Brown punk, both as a reckoning with the historical politics of race and gender in punk cultures, and as a genealogy that demonstrates how the past resonates in the present. Martin Sorondegay of the hardcore band Los Crudos writes about his experience with the band and its drummer. While staying with Michelle Cruz Gonzalez, there were many conversations about subjects that pushed outside the boundaries of music. Her stories of growing up Chicana and Tulumne resonated with us, and Los Crudos were down with her. We were hardcore kids from Chicago that came across varied stories of growing up Latino or Chicano in other parts of the country, and we were fascinated with such stories. We connected, as we did with so many on these tours, with other brown kids who had their own stories of struggle and survival, pressures to conform or assimilate, to bow under the gaze of the almighty institutions that pumped a filtered, inaccurate history told only by one side. We are the survivors of these institutions, and luckily we took a different road, one that led us to no longer doubt our worth. The path we took ceased to be one of shame or denial of who we were. Like love and community, music is what many turn to feel validated, seen, held, to feel. Not only then is it a site of affirmation, joy, and pleasure, but one of radical potential and possibility. Young women were engaging with feminism again. The mainstream was very white. I wanted to find Black feminist spaces and discuss writers like Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks, explains Shardine Taylor Stone about meeting Stephanie Phillips at a Black feminist organization. The two went on to form Big Joni. People call us a lot of things, but we're still punk, says Phillips, because for me, punk means freedom. It's open and constantly growing. And now to return to Gilman Opolsky once more, it is time to fully realize the fact that love, if love means anything at all, is antithetical to the logic of capital. To understand what love does for real people in the real world is to grasp its communism, and ultimately to reconcile ourselves with the communist aspiration in all of us. If we don't understand love as a refuge from, as an alternative to the rule of capital, we misunderstand love and overlook the communism right there before us, indeed between us. In the face of an increasingly precarious, violent, and fascistic present, it is not enough and cannot be enough to just have a future worth fighting for anymore. If we want to build militant, sustainable, movements that can stand a fighting chance against capitalism and its guardians. We must make the present one filled with things and moments worth living for, one filled with love, community, and belonging, where healing is possible and we do more than just survive. To make this possible, we must recenter our right to rest, care, beauty, pleasure, self-expression, and love, not simply as a way to remind ourselves of the future we wish to create, but as things we deserve now, and which will buoy our spirits and allow us to fight another day.
Great. Thank you so much. Wow. I so loved both of your talks, and like all of them just wove into each other very beautifully. I also want to remind everyone that if you're watching the YouTube stream, please write in any comments or questions you have. We have some time to answer any of them, so it's a great opportunity to sort of to dialogue with us and to just share any thoughts or questions that you might have. Right now it looks like we have comments from Laura Sullivan, who says that in case folks haven't read it, a provocative analysis of protests, Occupy London and its relationship to time, is The Scene of Occupation by Tavia Nyong'o, and Sullivan is reminded of Leroy Jones, Amiri Baraka's Blues People and the Music, Art of the Black Arts Movement, the Spiritual and Political Power of John Coltrane's A Love Supreme, and the groundbreaking and crucial book Development Arrested, The Blues and Plantation Power in the Mississippi Delta by Clyde Woods. Yeah, thank you so much for those suggestions. And I also, in thinking about Leroy Jones / Amiri Baraka, I know that Diane DePrima has also been kind of in the public consciousness because of the 50th anniversary of her poetry collection, Revolutionary Letters. I think these are all kind of interwoven really beautifully. So yeah, please keep the comments coming. I'll just start with a few of my own. And Stella and Alex, if either of you have questions to any of us, please jump in. I feel like I have infinite questions that I could possibly ask. So I'll just start with this concept of a kind of collective feeling. And Stella, you referred to Raymond Williams' structures of feeling. Some trouble that I sometimes run into in my own work is how to sort of theorize and think about feeling as something that could possibly be collective, because I feel like the way that we've grown up, at least I did in the North American context, of thinking about artworks as a kind of individual interpretation, and it grates me to no end, this emphasis on how, the individual opinion and response to a specific artwork. And I feel like I'm constantly trying to explain what exactly I personally mean by a collective feeling that is something that is not merely an individual response, but something that is shared. So I'm curious how you kind of think about that in your own work and of your own activism, and how we can kind of break that sort of capitalist mindset of the individual experience of the artwork versus the collective one.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good question, right? And I think one that like so many of us struggle with because it's so entrenched, the individualism in every aspect of our lives. And so that's what we reach for instinctually, intellectually, to understand the world around us. Again, whether it's, a piece of art that we're encountering, or a struggle at work, or, you don't have hot water in your apartment. We reach for our interpretation of it and our experience of it because we've only ever known that we are individuals before we're anything else, or sometimes in some cases that we're just individuals. Like there is such a lack of consciousness that relates us to a collective. And I think this is one of the reasons why the pandemic shifted so many things and like pushed so many people into struggle that maybe had never participated, even before maybe they understood the theoretical or ideological reasons for why they were, moved to participate in big and small ways, right? Whether it's taking something to a community fridge, or joining one of the mass marches after the murder of George Floyd. And there are so many ways in which people who never before participated in things were moved to. And in conversation with a lot of people, I find that a lot of times they didn't even know how to really explain it. It's not that the injustice had, become worse or somehow like finally made sense. Like they're like, no, this is the all of these instances of police brutality and police murder have enraged me, and yet I've never been called to join a protest, to join a march, to participate in mutual aid, any number of these things. And so it's like, in a lot of cases, people didn't even know how to answer that question. And I think it's because intellectually, yes, what we reach for is largely rooted in this individualism that we've all been steeped in our entire lives, and have had to intentionally unlearn at some point, those of us who've radicalized and are militant and all that stuff. But on the visceral level, there is that feeling that is shared, that is more universal. And so even though there might be spectrums of how we feel and understand certain events or moments, and intellectually we might be on opposite ends, and we understand it and intellectualize it on one hand as a collective experience, and then on the other a purely individual experience. Viscerally though, I think that that paradigm or that distinction gets blurred because we feel it first, and our somatic experience, our embodied experience of things have a sort of wisdom that we're not yet equipped to, as a collective, to understand and even and be able to articulate. But I think so. I think it's the visceral experience, the embodied somatic experience that connects us, and that actually undermines that hyper individualism that capitalism relies on, and and has built all these structures to continue to perpetuate. And the reason it has to have all these mechanisms and systems to uphold it and to perpetuate it is because it is actually antithetical to what is natural to us, the visceral somatic response.
Alex, do you have thoughts on the concept of kind of a collective feeling? It also wrote what Stella answered that so beautifully. I was thinking also about Marxist alienation, right, as a kind of self-alienation. We think, oh, we are all of these little separated individuals, but even that concept is kind of an alienation from collectivity, right? As opposed to this singular, perfectly formed unit. It's actually fundamentally a process of capitalist alienation. Yeah. Alex, go ahead. And then I think you also had a question that you wanted to raise too. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think to me the idea of how do you how do we figure out a way to me it's less about arguing between which interpretation is the best, though I think that's still necessary and always has a role to play. But I think of Massimiliano Tomba's notion of insurgent universality, where he talks about in revolutionary moments, it's not necessarily about getting the subaltern to speak with one voice. It's having all of those different voices sort of work in a harmony together. I'm bound to use a lot of musical metaphors and analogies right here, so you'll have to bear with me. I mean, I guess it's appropriate considering the subject of the book. But really, what we're talking about here is how do you accomplish a differentiated totality? You know, all these different parts of the working class that have different, not just the working class, but really the proletariat, you know, all of the people writ large who subsist in one way or another off of wage labor, even if they're not necessarily within the technical term of working class. How do you get all of them to work in conjunction? How do you accomplish sort of Gramscian hegemony among them? To me, the metaphor between that and art, in particular music, is really interesting to me, because in popular music, you have all of these different instruments and all of these different components that are working together to create this rhythmic experience that I talk about in the book. And in some moments, they're really conscious. Musicians are very conscious about how this creates a kind of radical democratic paradigm. If you look at bebop and jazz and that movement within it, they're like, we're all improvising together to find sort of like a singular mode that all of us kind of work together. And to me, the parallel between that and the way we organize a collective revolutionary subject is very apparent to me, or I shouldn't say apparent, because that comes off as somewhat dismissive. What I actually mean is I think it's worth investigating, and this is precisely why we need those spaces that can provide the temporal and physical space for people to create art, investigate culture, investigate ideas, independent from where they what neoliberalism is sort of deemed necessary for us. Other than that, I think actually Stella answered it beautifully, so I won't gild the lily too much there and go on with that. But yeah, those are the things that came to mind for me.
And did you want to ask the question that you had mentioned earlier about spaces and?
Yeah, well, I mean, I actually, now that there's questions actually in the chat, I would want to prioritize them. Actually, I want to hear what people think.
Yeah,
so you can get back to that if I have time, you know. So if we have time, so.
Yeah, and a great reminder for everyone to put questions up on YouTube. We'll get to as many of them as we possibly can, and we have quite a bit of time, so please do. So don't worry, and please submit your questions and comments. So there's a great question from Diane Feely. SNCC had both direct action and music, but in most cases in the US, aren't culture and movement work pretty distant from each other, even when appreciated by the other? I love this question because I feel like it gets to sort of the root of what I think all of us are talking about. I can go on and on, but maybe I'll let Alex and Stella answer first, and I'll jump in if there's time. Mm-hmm.
I would just answer that in saying, yes, they are distant from each other, and that's part of the problem. No, not part of the problem. That is the problem. You know, if we think of art as having a pedagogical role for creating, again, a revolutionary working class subject, then yeah, that's a big part of the problem. I think it also creates a lot of what the conditions in which Stella talked about. I think all of us are very, unfortunately, most of us are very used to organizing work as being very rote and sometimes feeling like a second, third, or fourth job on top of what we have, and it can feel very soul crushing. And some of that, I think, it just has to do with the atomization of the left that we're only just starting to come out of after the gains of the 60s were defeated, the rise of neoliberalism smashed unions, smashed social movements. And so the revolutionary and Marxist left really sort of was just like white knuckling it there for about 40 some odd years, trying to figure out what we need to sort of just hold down the basics. And I think we're in a place right now where we not only can afford to, but need to start to think about all of this in a more effervescent way, and start to think about how do we make our revolutionary and socialist organizations less alienated and alienating? And so I think that's why we need those sort of spaces of creativity and talk about different ways of learning other than just like, well, frankly, the format that we have here, which is, speakers who supposedly know everything, and then, a passive kind of audience and things like that. Not that anyone's being necessarily passive here, but I think people get what I'm kind of saying. It's the same thing as like breaking down the way that bourgeois and certainly neoliberal approaches to art sort of laud the artistic genius and make all of us into a sort of a passive audience. We need to sort of play with rubrics play with new rubrics of learning and new ways of methods of struggling and building collective power that problematize and break down those divisions. And so I think that's precisely why we need to have this kind of better integration of art and culture as well as theory and action together. I think we need to sort of recalibrate the coordinates between all of those.
Yeah, everything that Alex just said, absolutely spot on. But I think there's a little, I want to take it a little further. And so, yes, there is this big distinction that exists, and this distance that is created between art and culture generally and movement work. And Alex explained a lot of what we should be doing to change that. But I also think that there is another layer or level at which we have to approach it. And I think the idea that art and culture is distinct from work and movement work, that we still see it as like a nice accessory or respite from movement work. We don't actually see it as part of the work. And I think that's one of the issues with that the left now today is grappling to wrap its head around, try and undo, reconfigure, because I come from an organizing background where, like Alex said, it was like a second or third or fourth job, and it was not fun and it was tedious, and that's all part of all of the work. We know that, but it doesn't have to be the totality of work, right? Of that work. It doesn't have to be the totality of what it means to struggle. Like there should be, and there are plenty of histories of struggle that is embedded and infused with community and love and creativity. And we need to bring that back. And the other thing is that big question of like, what is the purpose of art and music? Is it just to escape the reality? Is it just to, give us something nice to enjoy in our downtime? Is it to be didactic and say, this is the way forward for revolution, prescriptive? What is the purpose of art? And as many of us have discussed on this panel, it's really about undoing the atrophy that's happened around our imagination and our ability to imagine different worlds, different ways of being, different ways of seeing, showing up, experiencing things. And I think for me, that is the purpose of art, beyond, the need for self-expression that is innate to the human experience. It is about self-actualization of the individual, but more generally of the collective that is humanity. And for the left, for revolutionary politics, art's purpose, I think, and this is why it can't just be looked at as this prescriptive thing where we only write protest songs and only make, protest films, that it has to be its own thing that transcends that is not prescriptive, and that isn't like, here's the theory with a really beautiful like scene, or here's the theory sung. It has to be more than that, because it's about pushing beyond what we know, what we've experienced, what we can conceptualize now, because our ability to imagine more has been so atrophied and been done so deliberately. And so I think there's, the most clear example that I can point to right now of like how to bring these two together is the Union of Musicians and Allied Workers that Alex mentioned in his presentation. These are musicians that are fighting for better work conditions, right? And that, I don't think that all of the musicians who are doing that are writing protest songs because it's, they're of the left and they're, so they're not being prescriptive in their art. And they're also saying our art is labor and it needs to be recognized as such. And our labor conditions need to be drastically different than what they are. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I love all of these answers, and I agree with everything Stella and Alex just said. I wanted to add maybe 3 sort of concrete kind of manifestations of what both Stella and Alex have been talking about. And I apologize that stays on this question, but I love this question because it really like gets to the fundamental root of the problem. Of this gap between movement work and arts and culture. So three examples of how these should and can and sometimes have been sort of brought together, movement work and culture. The first is pretty obvious, like in the sense of when, and as Alex mentions in his book, often at protests there is chanting, there is singing, and at least I've had the experience of going to a protest, and when someone starts singing, I don't know, "Solidarity Forever" for those people that know more than like half of one stanza, and it is just so galvanizing singing in a group, even with half of everyone has terrible voices, and that's part of the beauty of this cacophony. In New York, when I lived in New York, I was a part of Sing in Solidarity, which is the New York City DSA's leftist choir, socialist choir. And what we would do is at protests, we would practice singing socialist songs like Bella Ciao, the clip that you showed us, Alex, and we would have concerts. And one Pueblo, yeah, exactly. So we would have this like repertoire, and usually for a protest we would have a really cheap, like Xeroxed booklet of a number of more of the easy songs, especially like IWW Red Book kind of songs, and we'd pass them out, and it's pretty easy. Like people will just pick up a melody. Like it's amazing the human mind's ability to do that. And just like passing around these booklets in a protest immediately made everyone so much more excited. And you just see people like light up smiling when they're given the chance to sing in a group. It's a really amazing feeling and doesn't require very much work, just like passing around a little booklet that you use a work copier to scan like 50 copies of, no problem. So that's a very a pretty basic kind of way in which the two should be combined. But then there's also the fact that I have found, during the pandemic that, and we see this in our daily life, that we feel so much more connected to movement work when we are able to encounter our comrades face to face, and when we feel like they are our comrades outside of movement work. And like, yes, the separation of movement work and friendship, obviously, that becomes problematic at some point. But fundamentally, when we feel like we are there for our friends and comrades, as well as for, a kind of larger values and kind of Marxist ideas and things like that, that's when things really become vibrant and interesting. And I remember, going to all of these Zoom meetings, but things only really started feeling real when people started meeting face to face, outside. And it was actually, I had just moved to Philly when the like a few months before the pandemic started, and I was going to all of these really, pretty boring Zoom meetings, and it felt like a slog that both of you have been talking about. And then it was someone's birthday, and we decided to venture out into the world, and the weather happened to be beautiful. And that was the moment where I feel like it switched into another gear, where you need some of the, the cultural, exciting day-to-day, non-explicitly movement-oriented, experiences in order to feel that much more devoted, right, to the movement work. There are also ways in which, just like a third quick example in terms of taking over abandoned urban spaces or reinvigorating urban spaces, that is something that might not explicitly be political and connected as explicitly movement oriented, but as Alex points out in his book and as Stella mentioned, are absolutely ways of crafting community and of making people excited about movement work and having us think about urban spaces in a totally different way. There's something called, I've been meaning to mention this, What the Float, which is a kind of outdoor silent disco that happens in New York and Los Angeles and Atlanta now, but it has also happened in Seattle and Philadelphia and Chicago that I work with and DJ for sometimes. But that was actually described recently in Current Affairs, I believe, as an example of modern day situationism. Of when you're listening to these pre-crafted mixes on headphones and it's some raver type EDM music, but not just, and you're kind of going through public spaces. You're not getting permission to do it usually. You're just kind of, guerrilla style worming your way through parks and city streets in order to have people think of public spaces in a totally different way and actually use them as opposed to how they've been usually kind of used in capital, right? So there are already existing ways of doing that, but they might not be always thought of as explicitly kind of leftist inclined. Okay, next we have a question from Patricia McManus. Can culture be potentially politically committed, maybe not necessarily on the left, when it is part of a commercial genre? For example, San Francisco's provision of the world building capacities of Suttons Novum. Yeah, I think this is great. I guess another way of asking that might also be, and I think Alex, you bring this up in your book, the sort of contradictions within popular genres. At what point where are they kind of keeping the status quo, and at what point do they break that, and where to see those contradictions, how to emphasize the non-commercial aspects? Yeah.
So I think Patricia, when they say SF, I think they mean speculative fiction, not San Francisco.
Oh, you're right. Sorry. I was like,
No,
I didn't really know.
it's all
I
good.
was like, I would say SF is San Francisco. Okay, yeah, you're right. So science fiction for sure.
Very true. Yeah, science fiction, speculative fiction. I'm not intensely familiar with Darko Suvin, other than the most general sense. I know that someone who is Adam Turrell, who I work with in the Locust Arts and Letters Collective. But I just going off the rest of the substance of the question, can culture be politically committed when it's part of a commercial genre? I think we don't have a choice except to say yes, even with all of the contradictions. I think we need to strive to make art that reaches as wide an audience as possible. And unfortunately, right now, that means reaching a commercial audience. That they're reaching an audience that only commercial institutions are able to reach, while also not compromising on it. Is that an impossible task? Absolutely. And do we also need the spaces that are autonomous from commercial interests? Yes, 100%. And I think that kind of the tension between those two truths is precisely where I think it's the same contradiction of how do you make revolutionary ideas accessible for every working person without watering them down and without insulting the intelligence of the audience, of the people that you're talking to understand that working people are intensely intelligent and sensitive. We just haven't had really the chance to really let that bloom. So I think, yes, it can be. Like someone who I do know a lot about in science fiction and speculative fiction is, the example of Ursula Le Guin, who is now, and part of this is the fact that she tragically passed away 5 years ago, but since her death, she has become sort of like the standard bearer of science fiction's conscience in some ways. And some of that is simply the fact that it's easy to market it's easier to market a rebel after they're dead, because dead people don't push back and don't talk about, hey, you stop using my legacy for this type of stuff. But also not all of the as a matter of fact, I'd say in some cases very little of Le Guin being held up as a sort of, like I said, the standard bearer, the conscience of science fiction, has to do with simply how easy it is now to market her. I think it comes out of the contradiction of the world that she left behind is filled with young people who want their imaginations to have a place to really run free, that also affirms the values that they don't see operated in the real world. So I think that's just one example of how, like, an incredibly commercially successful writer or artist can still provide spaces of radical imagination. I think there's a lot of, but one last thing to say also, and I won't spend too much time on this, is this precisely why we need autonomous artists and creatives, organizations, be they in the forms of unions, or although especially in the forms of unions, to actually fight for to make those commercial spaces more friendly, more habitable, whatever, for radical ideas. I think that's just one reason that we need those types of struggle and combat organizations for creatives and for the imagination. Stop there.
Yeah, I'm not going to take on the question because I think Alex provided the sort of answer that I might, but I did want to maybe turn the question not on its head, but shift it a little bit. So I'm less interested in like considering what interventions we can make in commercial cultural spaces, and more interested in what Alex just sort of like ended with, the like focusing more on independent DIY spaces and making those, sort of bringing them back, making them more accessible. And that's because, so I'm thinking a lot about social media, and how it's come to sort of dominate not just every aspect of, of our world, but also our organizing, right? And I think when social media really exploded, maybe 10 years ago, a little bit over 10 years ago, Facebook was already around, but specifically with Instagram and Twitter, who are about like 10, 12 years old, we really thought, oh my God, this is how we're going to like really make politics accessible and democratize things and bring them to the masses, and our movements are going to grow exponentially, and this is it. And then 10 years, 12 years in, like, that's not the case. None of the movement spaces that I have ever been part of grew because of whatever we were doing on social media. And so, we really thought social media was going to be how we delivered these messages and got these ideas to the masses. And the ideas were distributed and they did reach the masses, but that didn't translate into action. That didn't translate into, movements growing and taking more power in the spaces that they were organizing and operating in, struggling in. And so this is why I'm less interested in like trying to figure out how to infiltrate into commercial spaces and like, get like communist. And I'm not saying that this is what the person's asking, what Patricia's asking, but like, I think if like, oh man, and I know Beyonce has been a big topic, and I've written about Beyonce, about the importance of her culturally. And so, a lot of times people are disappointed when she, says things that are clearly like not in alignment with the majority of her listeners, who are either working class, not wealthy. And I think it's because we keep thinking that reaching masses and that's how we're going to change things, that like finally people will flock because so millions saw this message, so they're going to come, right? And we've seen that has not been the case. That has not translated from social media, from reaching the masses with our messages, with our calls to action. Like that hasn't translated. And so I'm less interested in the commercial aspect of it, and I'm more interested in like experimenting and coming back to smaller formations and smaller groups and making it a really like embodied experience of like ideologically like carrying that with us, and not just seeing a figure say something that is in alignment with what we feel or what we want. And I think that is how we build that sustainability as things shift and, we roll backwards and maybe like catapult forwards. Like the sustainability is what ensures people stick around and do that work and go with the ebbs and flows and ups and downs, and tied to. And the reason why I think like, let's experiment, let's go back to like smaller formations. And what Julia said about like, it is so different to be in spaces together than it is to be on Zoom. And that comes back to the question of alienation, right? Like alienation cannot exist in community, right? Community kills alienation. And this is why community is so important, not only because it ceases to keep us feeling alienated, but it also creates the conditions necessary for people to return to the work when it's grueling and when they're already exhausted. And that's because the only way that you feel that you'll make yourself show up is if you feel a sense of responsibility towards each other. And you can't build a sense of responsibility to another unless you care about them and their well-being. And you only do that through community, through comradeship, through friendship. And so this is like why community is so dangerous to capitalism, and because it kills the alienation necessary, right? So I'm less interested in the commercial aspect of how we can bring these ideas into commercial spaces and into the masses. I'm more interested in what we can do with art and music and creativity and self-expression, all of things which are innate in us and which we want to do, and sometimes don't know how to even engage with. How do we create spaces, big and small, formal and informal, to do that? Because that, I think, will create the community necessary for our movements and art and creativity to just sort of like synergistically come together without having to force them together.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I also feel like there are ways of the work you've been doing, thinking about Beyonce, like ways of mobilizing, commercial genres, while also criticizing them too. I think there's always an important element of critique that no one should be, deified, right? Beyonce, for example. Yeah, it makes me think about, for instance, like Squid Games, right? So something like Squid Games brought up a lot of really interesting things into the cultural imaginary. People of all different ages were watching it and seeing this critique of capital on Netflix. But then fundamentally, every stream is making Netflix money, so it is kind of a paradox or a contradiction that needs to be that needs to be discussed. To what extent can a purely commercial genre, even if it's anti-capitalist in content, be fully, anti-capitalist in its production? Like that needs to be constantly thought about and questioned. Even if fundamentally, I think the fact that Squid Games exists is good, it's helpful, but always needs to be, thought about and critiqued within its production models. And that was happening in the 60s all the time. So another way in which the current moment in the 60s are sort of in alignment in an interesting way. Alex, you mentioned Ursula Le Guin. I also think Octavia Butler absolutely has been in the public imaginary, but I think in the last few years, even more so than Ursula Le Guin, perhaps, as an example of, a science fiction writer that does not abandon pleasure, and the pleasure politics, and that Adrienne Maree Brown has written a lot about Octavia Butler in relation to her work on politics of pleasure and pleasure activism. And I think this term pleasure is this concept of pleasure is a really interesting one, connecting all of our work here. Another sort of science fiction oriented book I wanted to plug was something that I've been thinking about in the last few months a lot, a book published by Common Notions last year called Everything for Everyone, an Oral History of the New York Commune 2052 to 2072, which does what leftists are really bad at doing, if I might say so, is imagining a future, which is also something that SF does, less San Francisco, more that's a more dystopian future. I don't want to think about it. Sorry, I think that was where my wires got crossed there. It is sort of a dystopian science fiction universe. Apologies for anyone in San Francisco. Yeah, and let's see, we only have a few minutes, but I did want to bring up Patricia's other question of what happens to rage and pain in cultural practices if we desire only cultures of community or care and of care.
Ooh, can I jump in? Okay.
Go.
I think there's plenty of space for rage and pain in music in particular, right? But also in film. I mean, so much of art, like, there's always the joke that like you create your best artwork when you're heartbroken, or whatever. People's like best album, they were just dumped or whatever. But also like the rage, punk and hip hop and jazz and all, so much of our like favorite genres of music over the last half century are filled with rage, right? And sometimes it's explicit, sometimes it's implicit, but it's there, and it's, like I said, music is felt before it's understood. And so it is this embodied, visceral experience. And also I think, community and care don't need to obscure the full spectrum of the human experience, which is filled with joy and pleasure and rest, but it's also filled with like pain and rage and confusion, and all of the things that are really hard to hold. And this is why community and care is so important, because it's so hard to hold as an individual, right? Like, we heal in community. It's really hard to get over a breakup. It's really hard to get over the loss of someone on your own, right? Even if like you may need some like alone time at first, like it is in community, it is in connection with each other that like we find our way out of that. And so I think we should create and should desire to create cultures of community and care that have learned the skills. And this is why I mentioned it in my paper, that have learned the skills of how to hold space for each other and how to be in relationship with each other. And being in relationship with each other is hard, because we are flawed and we make mistakes and we hurt each other intentionally and unintentionally. And that doesn't mean that we need to be discarded from our spaces. Where repair can happen, it should happen. Where that's not possible for whatever reason, then there needs to be systems created for how we don't dehumanize people while also not allowing them to continue to perpetuate their harm. And there's the entire spectrum of the human experience, which is filled with both beautiful things and also absolutely terrible and terrifying experiences. And there's absolute space for pain and rage and despair in community. And I think it's only through community that we can process those really gutting things and retain our humanity and want to continue to exist in the world and also like show up for each other.
Yeah. First of all, I just want to make sure that so we're going to be going into final thoughts right now. So Stella, I didn't know if you had any other stuff to say, wrap up before it goes over to me. Cool. All right. So yes, everything to what Stella said. I would also, when I think about spaces that of care and community that also honor rage and pain, yes, once again, everything that Stella said is completely correct. I don't think there's any way to actually, build community that doesn't honor that doesn't allow us spaces to process that. What does that have to do with art and culture? I mean, that's. I'll just supplement by adding this. I don't know how many people have seen The Menu yet, but my favorite film of 2022. I think it's not irrelevant that one of its producers is a supporter of the Democratic Socialists in the U.S., whatever contradictions that might present. I don't think it's a coincidence. Also, that its two main writers wrote for what is probably the most important revolutionary publication currently publishing in the U.S. today. And of course, I'm talking about The Onion when I say that. But yeah, this is an absurdist, surrealist, dark comedy that 95% of its laughs and horror in it, because it's also a horror movie. 90% of the horror and the laughs comes from basically watching rich people be psychologically tortured, just absolutely fucked with in a way that you end up sort of sitting there saying like, crap, what's wrong with me that I'm laughing at this? But then you're like, well, no, this is catharsis. This is because one of the themes of it is the ways in which the rich as a parasitic class, the bourgeoisie as a parasitic class, suck the joy out of even the most pleasurable vocations and activities that we have at our disposal: food, cooking, art, all of that type of stuff. And so we're given this, we're allowed to tap into our own rage and our own alienation in the way that that's completely that our own fulfillment and ontological vocation, or to quote Freire, are just stripped from us. We're allowed to tap into that and given a sense of kind of release by watching some of the people responsible for it be have our rage vicariously channeled onto them. Brilliant movie. I think it's really everyone should watch it. Partly because I'm a big proponent of surrealism, and there are way too few examples of that showing up in modern contemporary film. And I also think it goes towards Patricia's previous question. I think it is possible to make those types of radical, politically committed films and other mediums of art within the commercial. But yes, everything, while also agreeing with what Stella said, we need the autonomous spaces. And in my view, I don't think we can really talk about revolutionary art and therefore a revolutionary society without at least grappling with both ends of that contradiction. So yeah, I think I will just wrap up there and say, other than just to say, please buy my book. Speaking of commercialism.
Yeah, please do buy this great book. I certainly really enjoyed reading it. I wrote things all over the margins. So please support your local, socialist authors. So yeah, with that, I will wrap up. And thanks everyone for your great questions and comments, for watching the stream, which I think will be available afterwards also. And thanks to Stella and Alex for your participation, and for historical materialisms for giving us a space to talk. So with that, I'll wish everyone a good night if you're in the UK, or a good day if you're in North America and wherever you are. Yeah, I hope just solidarity with your organizing, and I hope everyone has a way of integrating culture and arts into their everyday organizing practice. Thanks, everyone.